August 1944. Camp Shanks, New York. The train jolted, a final shudder that sent a tremor up Elena's spine. The noise stopped. In the sudden quiet, the air tasted of coal dust and damp wool. Outside the grimy window, a flat, manicured greenness she could not pass. Trees stood in disciplined rows, nothing like the chaotic olive groves of home. She pressed a finger to the cold glass, tracing a bead of condensation. A world contained in a single drop of water. Unfamiliar. Her uniform, a coarse grey fabric, chafed at her neck. She had been wearing it for weeks. It smelled of the ship, of salt and sweat and fear. The other women in the carriage were silent, their faces pale masks in the fading light. A gate, topped with barbed wire, slid shut behind the last car. A solid metallic sound. A period at the end of a sentence she had not yet learned to read. There were men outside, American soldiers. They moved with a languid confidence, their limbs long and loose in their uniforms. One of them laughed, a bright, open sound that seemed to have no place here. Elena watched his mouth form the shape of the laugh, but the meaning did not reach her. It was just emotion, a brief parting of lips. She and the others were herded from the train, their boots crunching on the gravel. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of cut grass and something else, something sweet and industrial. He looked up, expecting the low, familiar sky of Italy, scarred by smoke and trace of fire. Instead, the sky was a vast, indifferent blue, empty except for a single high-flying plane that glinted like a sliver of mica. They were counted. Their names, mangled by American tongues, were called from a list. Each woman stepped forward, a small act of obedience in a vast theater of surrender. Elena's focus narrowed to the details. The crisp fold in a guard's trousers, the polished leather of an officer's shoes. The way the sunlight caught the gold insignia on his collar. These were the only solid things in a world that had dissolved into a dream. They were marched toward a series of long, low buildings, barracks, identical, numbered, anonymous. The geometry of the place was unnerving, all straight lines and right angles, a place built by a ruler, not by hand. She felt a deep, physical disorientation, the kind a person feels when waking in a strange room. The sun was setting, but the camp was beginning to glow with its own artificial light. Bulbs strung on poles flickered to life, casting harsh white circles on the ground. A world without shadows, a world without history. Her hand instinctively went to a small lump in her pocket, the last photograph of her family, its edges softened from constant touch. It was a tether to a reality that seemed, with every passing moment, less and less real. The train journey had been a transition between worlds, from the chaotic port to the ordered logic of the camp. But the ship before it had been a void. Weeks on the Atlantic, a grey, churning expanse that erased all sense of direction. They were the women of the Servizio Ausiliario Femminile *, the SAF, volunteers for Mussolini's last stand, the Italian Social Republic. They had been clerks, nurses, radio operators. They had believed in the cause, in the *juice, in the promise of a new Roman Empire. They were not conscripts, they had chosen their side. Captured by the advancing Allies in the final, bitter months of the war in northern Italy, they had expected a prison camp in their own country, a place within the known geography of their lives. Instead, they were processed, tagged, and loaded onto a troop transport ship like any other piece of military equipment. Sofia, a former teacher from Bologna, had tried to keep a log scratching dates onto the back of a hidden postcard. But the days bled into one another, each one a copy of the last. The metallic tang of the water from the ship's tanks, the rhythmic creak of the hull, the sight of the same exhausted faces in the cramped, airless hold. The journey was designed to dislocate them not just from their homes, but from their identities. Their uniforms were taken, replaced with rough, unmarked shifts. Their personal effects were catalogued and stored. They were numbers on a manifest. The true stakes were not just survival, but the preservation of a self that was being systematically dismantled. They were prisoners of a country they knew only through propaganda. America was a caricature, a nation of gangsters and jazz musicians, of decadent capitalists and racial chaos. It was supposed to be a fragile, hollow power, ready to collapse under the weight of its own corruption. Yet the ship that carried them across the ocean was a testament to a different reality. It's not a grand vessel, but one of thousands, a liberty ship, as one of the English-speaking women had learned. A thing mass-produced, functional, and overwhelmingly solid. It was a product of a system, and now they were inside that system, small cogs in a machine whose scale they could not yet comprehend. The Camp Shanks was another part of the machine. It was a port of embarkation, a massive transit hub that had processed over 1 million American soldiers on their way to Europe. And now, in a strange reversal, it was processing them, the enemy, on their arrival. The constraints were absolute: barbed wire fences, guard towers, the incomprehensible English of their captors. But the most powerful constraint was informational. They knew nothing of the war's progress, of their families' fates, of what would happen to them tomorrow. They were suspended in a state of profound ignorance, a condition that was more unnerving than any physical hardship. This was the wider context. From Alina's sensory confusion to the shared condition of several hundred women, unmoored from their nation, their cause, and their future, delivered into the heart of the enigma they had been trained to hate. The first and most powerful assault on their ideology came not from interrogation or propaganda, but from the mess hall. It was a long, cavernous room smelling of disinfectant and baked bread. The contrast it presented to their lived reality was a physical shock, a violence of abundance. In Italy, food had become an abstraction, a constant, gnawing anxiety. A typical meal in the final years of the war was a thin soup of indeterminate vegetables, a slice of coarse, dark bread that was mostly sawdust, and if one was lucky, a sliver of cheese. Rations were measured in grams. Calories were a luxury. Here they were handed metal trays and filed down a line where servers, other prisoners in white aprons, slopped food on with an air of bored indifference. Sophia stared at her tray. There were 2 thick slices of white bread, so soft it seemed an affront to the very idea of bread. A square of yellow butter glistening under the lights, a piece of fried chicken, a mound of mashed potatoes with a pool of gravy, a serving of green beans that were a vibrant, impossible green, and a cup of coffee, black and steaming, with a bowl of pure white sugar on the table. The sight and smell were so overwhelming that for a moment she felt nauseous. She watched the other women. Some ate with a desperate animal hunger. Others, like Lucia, a devout fascist from a small village, looked at the food with suspicion, as if it were a trick, a poison. Lucia picked at the chicken, her movements stiff. She could not reconcile this feast with her image of a struggling enemy. A nation that could feed its prisoners this way was not a nation on the brink of collapse. Then came the waste. Alina watched, mesmerized, as an American guard finished his meal, leaving half a piece of chicken and a full slice of bread on his plate. He scraped it all into a large garbage can without a second thought. Alina's mind did a quick automatic calculation. That discarded food could have fed a small child for a day. She saw women at other tables doing the same, scraping perfectly good food into the bins. The sheer quantity of it was staggering. It wasn't just a meal, it was a weapon. It was a statement of power more potent than any bomb or tank. The contrast extended to every material aspect of their new lives. The blankets on their bunks were thick, soft wool, not the threadbare, patched coverings they had known. The soap in the washroom was a hard, white cake that produced a rich lather, a world away from the gritty, homemade lye soap of home. The barracks themselves were simple wooden structures, but they were weathertight and solid. The plumbing worked. Hot water came out of the taps. It was a level of functional, standardized quality that was utterly alien. Their own bodies became a point of comparison. The Italian women were thin, wiry, their skin sallow from years of poor nutrition. They looked at the American female staff, the waxen nurses, and saw women who seemed to be of a different species. They were taller, on average, with broader shoulders. Their cheeks were full and colored with health. They moved with an energy that seemed to come from a deep, inexhaustible well. It was the simple, biological evidence of a population that had never known true hunger. A quiet, devastating comparison, repeated every day, 3 times a day, in the simple, mundane act of eating a meal. The women processed this flood of new information in different ways, their minds filtering the evidence through the mesh of their pasts and personalities. Alina, young and methodical, became a silent accountant of the impossible. She sat on her bunk in the evening, long after the lights-out command, and mentally tabulated the day's observations. She counted the supply trucks that entered the camp each morning, their beds laden with crates of food and supplies. 27 today. She counted the number of new light bulbs she saw being replaced in a single afternoon. 12. She counted the pairs of sturdy leather boots on the American soldiers, noting that none were scuffed or in need of repair. Each number was a small, hard fact, a pebble dropped into the well of her long-held beliefs, sending ripples of doubt through her. She wrote nothing down. The diary she kept was purely internal, a ledger of dissonance. One afternoon, a guard gave her a piece of chewing gum. She had never seen it before. He made a chewing motion with his jaw to demonstrate. Hesitantly, she unwrapped the small stick. The scent was intensely sweet, artificial. She put it in her mouth and was overwhelmed by the flavor of peppermint. It was a sensation with no purpose, a purely frivolous pleasure. She chewed, her mind racing. A country that had enough sugar and rubber to mass-produce such a useless thing was a country operating on a different plane of existence. Sophia, the teacher, focused on the system, the logistics. She had a mind for organization, and she saw it everywhere. She watched the camp laundry operate, a marvel of industrial efficiency with huge steaming machines that washed, dried, and pressed clothes with a speed she could barely follow. She recalled the back-breaking labor of laundry day in her village, the women beating clothes against rocks in the cold river. "They have made a science of everything," she murmured to Alina one evening, "even of washing." Sophia tried to engage the American nurses in the infirmary, piecing together their meaning from her limited English and their gestures. A nurse, a kind-faced woman named Miller, tried to explain where the penicillin they used came from. She spoke of factories, of vast fermentation tanks, of a supply chain that stretched across the continent. Sophia understood perhaps one word in 5, but she grasped the essential concept. The medicine was not a rare, precious resource, but a manufactured good, produced on a scale that dwarfed Italy's entire pharmaceutical industry. This wasn't just wealth, it was organized systemic power. Lucia, however, saw only moral decay. Her faith in the fascist ideal was rigid, a fortress she desperately defended against the evidence of her senses. She interpreted the abundance as proof of American soullessness. "They are a nation of gluttons," she would whisper to the other women in the barracks at night. "They have no spirit, only appetites. This softness will be their undoing." But her pronouncements grew less confident with each passing week. She saw the guards, young men who chewed gum and read comic books, but who also cleaned their rifles with meticulous care and followed their orders with unthinking efficiency. She saw the nurses who were patient and professional, who treated the Italian prisoners with a detached kindness that was more unnerving than cruelty. Her worldview provided no category for an enemy that was both decadent and competent. She began to pray more, her rosary beads a constant, frantic presence in her hands, a shield against a reality that was becoming too powerful to deny. The mechanism that produced the endless bread, the sturdy blankets, and the potent medicines was invisible from within the confines of the camp. It was a ghost in the machine, a silent, pervasive force, but its architecture could be deduced from its effects, much as one can deduce the presence of a massive star by the way it bends the light around it. The system was American industrial mobilization, an economic and logistical colossus, unlike anything the world had ever seen. What Alina and Sophia were witnessing were the end products of a vast, continent-spanning assembly line that was utterly alien to their experience. The first part of the system was geography. America was a fortress continent, protected by 2 vast oceans. Unlike Europe, its factories, farms, and cities were not being bombed into rubble. Its power grid was intact. Its railway lines were clear. While Italian industry was being systematically dismantled by Allied bombers, American industry was expanding at an exponential rate. Sophia, with her teacher's mind, tried to imagine it. A map of her country was a map of front lines, of occupied zones, of broken bridges. A map of this country, she intuited, was a map of unbroken connections. The second part was a pre-existing culture of mass production. Concepts that were revolutionary in Europe were simply business as usual in America. The idea of the assembly line, where a complex process is broken down into small, repeatable steps, was not just for building cars. It was applied to everything. A schematic metaphor began to form in Sophia's mind. America was not a nation in the European sense. It was a factory for producing victory. It built Liberty ships, a term they had learned on their voyage, in a matter of days, not months. These were simplified, mass-produced cargo vessels. They were welded, not riveted, to save time. They were built in sections by workers who were often women and assembled at the docks. Over 2,700 of them were built. They were the conveyor belts of the system, carrying the factory's output, the tanks, the planes, the food, the soldiers, across the oceans. The camp itself was a product of this system. The barracks were constructed from prefabricated panels. The plumbing was standardized. The electrical wiring followed a single, repeatable plan. This allowed the U.S. Army to build a city for 50,000 people in a matter of months. Elena once saw a discarded blueprint near a construction site in the camp. She stared at the clean, rational lines, the precise measurements. It was a language of pure function. There was no beauty, no history, just a relentless, powerful logic. This logic extended to the people. The women observed how the American soldiers were trained, clothed, and fed using the same principles. The K-ration, a compact, prepackaged meal, was a marvel of nutritional engineering, designed for maximum calories in minimum space. It was food as fuel, another standardized component for the military machine. Sophia realized their fundamental error. They had been taught that the war was a clash of wills, of ideologies, of spiritual strength. But from this vantage point, it was clear that it was a clash of production capacities. They had brought their fighting spirit to a factory floor, and the factory was winning. The cognitive dissonance of the camp was a slow, grinding pressure, but the journey outside its walls was a sudden, violent shock, a moment that shattered their remaining frames of reference. A small group of the women, including Elena and Lucia, were selected for a supervised trip. The official purpose was unclear, perhaps a work detail, perhaps a carefully managed propaganda exercise. They were loaded onto a bus with blacked-out windows, which only heightened their disorientation. When the covers were finally removed, they were on a train, moving through a landscape of sprawling suburbs that soon gave way to the dense, vertical geography of a great city. It was New York. Nothing could have prepared them for the scale. Italian cities were ancient, built for people and horses. Their streets were narrow, their buildings made of stone and brick, rarely rising more than 5 or 6 stories. They were cities on a human scale. This was something else entirely. As the train emerged from a tunnel, Elena looked out the window and her breath caught in her throat. Before her was a forest of buildings so tall they seemed to challenge the sky itself, towers of steel and glass that disappeared into the low-hanging clouds. The word she knew was grattacielo, skyscraper. She had seen pictures, but pictures were flat, lifeless things. They could not convey the terrifying verticality, the sheer weight and mass of it all. It was an architecture of giants. She felt a profound sense of vertigo, a feeling of being impossibly small and fragile in the face of such power. Lucia made the sign of the cross, her lips moving in a silent prayer. To her, it was the Tower of Babel, an act of supreme arrogance, a monument to a godless people. The second shock was the light. They were taken on a carefully guarded walk through a part of the city. As dusk fell, the streets began to blaze with a light that was alien to them. In wartime Italy, cities were subject to strict blackouts. Light was a beacon for enemy bombers, a precious commodity to be conserved. Streets were treacherous and dark, with only slivers of moonlight to guide the way. Here light was a spectacle, an entertainment. Signs made of glowing glass tubes, neon sizzled and hummed in a riot of color. Red, blue, green, yellow. They advertised products Elena had never heard of: Coca-Cola, Chevrolet, Lucky Strike. The light was not for safety or navigation, it was for selling. It was a profligate, almost sinful, waste of energy. A city that could afford to burn this much light into the empty night was a city that feared nothing. Finally, there were the people. The sidewalks were crowded with civilians. Men in suits and hats, women in colorful dresses with seams running up the backs of their silk stockings. They moved with a speed and purpose that was jarring. They were not huddled or fearful. They laughed. They window-shopped. They carried bags filled with purchases. Elena saw a toy store, its window filled with dolls and electric trains. A bakery with a pyramid of frosted cakes. A world of consumer goods, of casual, thoughtless buying, existed alongside the war that had consumed her entire world. She saw a woman her own age, wearing a fur-collared coat, hailing a yellow taxi. In that single, simple gesture, Elena saw the chasm between their lives. A chasm not just of wealth, but of possibility, of expectation, of what it meant to be a young woman in the year 1944. The trip to the city became the fulcrum upon which their entire belief system tipped into imbalance. The foundational assumptions of their fascist ideology, drilled into them since childhood, were being systematically violated by direct, sensory evidence. The central tenet of their propaganda was that the democratic, capitalist West, particularly America, was decadent. The word used was plutocracia rule by the wealthy. It was portrayed as a society weakened by materialism, riddled with social decay, and lacking the spiritual and martial vigor of the new fascist man. They were told it was a hollow giant ready to crumble. But the giant was not hollow. The skyscrapers were not made of paper. The endless river of cars on the streets was not a mirage. The well-fed, well-clothed people were not actors. The power they witnessed was not brittle. It was deep, systemic, and terrifyingly robust. The clash was most acute for Lucia. Her mind furiously tried to reconcile the propaganda with reality. She sought out signs of the promised decay. She looked for poverty, for despair, for weakness. And while she might have seen a beggar or a drunkard, these were isolated instances, drowned in an overwhelming sea of prosperity and order. The system worked. The trains ran on time. The police directed traffic with calm authority. The stores were full. "This is the devil's work," she whispered to Elena on the train back to the camp. "He builds a beautiful facade to hide a rotten core." But her voice lacked conviction. It was the desperate argument of a believer whose God has gone silent. The experience also forced a radical inversion of their understanding of gender roles. Fascist ideology had a clear and rigid prescription for women, the donna madre asterisk, the woman mother. Her place was in the home. Her duty was to produce and raise loyal fascist children for the state. Ambition, authority, and public life were the exclusive domains of men. In America, they saw a different model. On the streets of New York, they saw women driving cars, a sight almost unheard of back home. In newsreels shown at the camp, they saw images of women working in factories, riveting the wings of bombers, their hair tied up in bandanas, the Rosie the Riveter archetype. This was not the feminine ideal they had been taught. These women were not delicate or domestic. They were competent, integral parts of the war machine. The most direct challenge came from the female American officers, the WACs. One particular lieutenant at Camp Shanks was responsible for their barracks. She was a tall, no-nonsense woman who carried a clipboard and spoke with an authority that was absolute. She was not cruel, but she was entirely in command. For Sophia, who as a teacher had held a position of some authority herself, this was a revelation. She watched the lieutenant organize work details, resolve disputes, and conduct inspections with an efficiency that was undeniable. This woman's power was not derived from a husband or a father. It was her own, earned through rank and competence. It directly contradicted everything she had been taught about the natural order of things. A question began to form in Sophia's mind, a quiet, heretical inquiry. What if their way was not the only way? What if a nation that allowed women this kind of agency was not weaker for it, but stronger? The women's observations were not just feelings or impressions. They began to be grounded by a slow accumulation of facts, numbers, and procedural details that filtered into the camp. This evidence, gleaned from conversations, discarded newspapers, and the sheer logic of their environment, formed a scaffold that supported their dawning, terrible understanding. There were roughly 51,000 Italian prisoners of war held in the United States. This was a number they learned from a guard. But of that total, they were a tiny, unique subset. Only a few hundred were women, members of the SAF. Their status was ambiguous. They were collaborators with the Germans, part of Mussolini's puppet state, but they were also Italian. This special status meant they were often held in more isolated conditions, which ironically gave them more time for the quiet, corrosive work of observation. They were moved between several camps during their internment. After Camp Shanks in New York, some were sent to Camp Ruston in Louisiana, others to a large facility in Hereford, Texas. Elena, a keen observer of systems, noticed that no matter the location, the camps were fundamentally the same. The barracks were the same design. The mess halls operated on the same schedule. The supply chain was a marvel of standardization. A truck delivering Coca-Cola to a dusty camp in Texas was part of the same logistical network that supplied bread to their barracks in New York. It was a single, continental system. The most powerful evidence remained the food. It became an obsession for Sophia to quantify it. She learned from a kitchen worker that the official U.S. Army ration for a prisoner of war was mandated to be the same as that for an American soldier in training, minus a few luxury items. This amounted to over 3,000 calories per day, sometimes approaching 4,000. It was a number that broke her understanding of economics. In Italy, a civilian ration was less than 1,000 calories. Even frontline soldiers were often getting less than 2,000. She kept a mental ledger of the weekly menu: eggs 3 times a week, meat or fish almost every day, milk, butter, sugar, coffee. These were not rations. They were luxuries beyond the imagination of the average Italian family. The evidence of America's productive power was everywhere. Unlike their male counterparts, who were often sent to work on farms or in non-military industries after Italy officially switched sides, the women were generally confined to camp duties. Elena was assigned to the camp post office for a time sorting mail. The sheer volume of it was a physical reality. Sacks and sacks of letters, packages filled with cookies, knitted socks, magazines. It was a river of paper and goods, connecting millions of soldiers to millions of families across a vast, functioning nation. She would hold a magazine in her hands, a copy of *Life or the *Saturday Evening Post*, and stare at the advertisements. Full-page, four-color ads for cars that weren't being made, for refrigerators that weren't for sale. An entire industry dedicated to stoking desire for a future of abundance, even in the midst of a global war. It was evidence of a society so confident in its ultimate victory that it was already planning the peace. Each fact was a hammer blow against the prison of their old beliefs. The constant, overwhelming cognitive dissonance began to exact a physical and psychological toll. The mind can only hold two contradictory ideas for so long before something begins to fracture. The evidence of American power was undeniable, yet the ideology that had defined their lives insisted it was impossible. This internal war manifested in their bodies, in the quiet, desperate hours of the night. Lucia suffered the most. The trip to New York had broken something deep inside her. She began to have crippling headaches that left her pale and trembling. She slept poorly, waking from nightmares she could not describe. The camp's security lights, which burned all night, became a source of torment. She felt they were peeling back her skin, exposing the doubt that was festering in her soul. She would lie on her bunk, her blanket pulled up to her chin, and stare at the ceiling, her mind a frantic loop of confusion. How can they be so strong? Where is God in this? Questions were a form of self-flagellation. She had volunteered, had sacrificed her youth for a cause she now suspected was built on a foundation of lies. The shame was a physical weight, pressing down on her chest, making it difficult to breathe. For Elena, the cost was different. It was not a crisis of faith, but a crisis of scale. The sheer size of America, its immense productive capacity, its casual power, had the effect of shrinking her own world, her own life, to a point of near invisibility. Her belief in the cause had made her feel like a part of something historic, something grand. Now she felt like a footnote, a statistical error. Her anxiety was a low, constant hum, a tightness in her gut. She would find herself staring at her own hands, turning them over and over, as if to reassure herself that she still existed. One evening, she felt a profound wave of derealization. The sounds of the barracks, the coughing, the quiet sobbing of another woman, the murmur of English from the guards outside, seemed to come from a great distance. Her own body felt foreign, a shell she was temporarily inhabiting. The entire experience, the war, the capture, the camp, felt like a bizarre, elaborate dream from which she would surely wake up. But she never did. The quietest moments were often the most intense. One night, long after the others were asleep, Sophia sat up on her bunk. She was not crying, she was not praying. She was preternaturally calm. The moonlight, filtered through the barracks window, striped the floor in bars of silver and black. She thought of her classroom in Bologna, the faces of the children looking up at her. She had taught them the patriotic songs. She had taught them about the glory of the Roman past and the promise of the fascist future. She had believed it, every word. And she realized, with a clarity that was as cold and sharp as glass, that she had been an instrument of a great and terrible lie. It was not a dramatic, shattering epiphany. It was a quiet, internal settling, like the collapse of a building in slow motion, all its structural supports finally giving way. A single, hot tear escaped her eye and traced a path through the dust on her cheek. It was not a tear of sadness or of anger. It was a tear of pure, undiluted exhaustion. The exhaustion of a soul that had been carrying a weight too heavy for it to bear and had finally, in the silent darkness, let it go. Elena was on a work detail, clearing weeds from the perimeter fence. It was a mundane, repetitive task, designed to keep them occupied. The sun was hot on her back. Nearby, an American guard, a young man with a spray of freckles across his nose, was finishing his lunch. He had an apple, red and perfect. He took a few bites, then seemed to lose interest. With a casual flick of his wrist, he tossed the half-eaten apple into a garbage bin. The gesture was thoughtless, trivial. But for Elena, watching from the corner of her eye, it was the final, clarifying piece of the puzzle. Everything, the skyscrapers, the neon lights, the mountains of food, the tireless machines, snapped into focus around that single, discarded piece of fruit. In that moment, a quiet, devastating revelation landed in her mind with the force of an explosion. They had been taught they were fighting a battle of spirit against decadence, only to discover they were fighting a battle of scarcity against abundance, and there was never any possibility of victory. The first implication was immediate and crushing. Their sacrifices had been meaningless. The young men she had known who had died on the Russian front or in the African desert had not died for a noble cause that was narrowly defeated. They had died in service of a fundamental miscalculation. They had been thrown against a machine that could produce more food, more steel, and more gasoline in a week than their nation could in a year. Their courage, their belief, their spirito asterisk, it had all been irrelevant, a rounding error in an industrial equation. The second implication rewrote her past. The propaganda that had been the soundtrack to her entire life was not just a political lie, it was a profound, almost willed ignorance. Her leaders had not simply been wicked, they had been blind. They had declared war on a country whose basic reality they did not comprehend. They had mistaken America's consumer culture for weakness, its informality for a lack of discipline, its diversity for a lack of unity. They had failed to see the factory humming quietly behind the facade. This realization did not make her hate them, it made her pity them. Finally, the revelation shattered her own identity. She was an Orsilaria asterisk, a female auxiliary of the Italian Social Republic. Her entire sense of self, of purpose, was bound up in that title. But if the Republic was founded on a fantasy, if the cause was doomed from the start by the simple laws of production, then what was she? A believer in a failed faith, a soldier in a phantom army. The half-eaten apples sat in the bin, attracting a fly. It was a symbol not of decadence, as Lucia would have seen it, but of a power so vast it did not need to count its apples. It was the power of a system that could afford to waste, because its capacity to produce was functionally infinite. And against that, no amount of spirit could ever prevail. The journey from the specific to the systemic was now complete. The half-eaten apple in Alina's perception was not just a piece of fruit, it was a data point, a human-scale manifestation of a system-scale truth. The casual gesture of the guard was not an individual moral failing. It was the logical endpoint of a causal chain that began in the vast, untouched farmlands of the American Midwest, moved through a highly efficient network of refrigerated transport, and ended here, in a prison camp where even the enemy was overwhelmed. The system of industrial agriculture, powered by cheap fossil fuels and mechanization, tends to produce massive surpluses. A society built on such surpluses may develop a culture where waste is not a sin, but an afterthought, a simple cost of doing business. The women's shock was the measure of the distance between their world and this one. They were the products of a scarcity-based society, where every crust of bread was precious, every drop of fuel was rationed, and every resource was husbanded. Their entire psychology was shaped by the constant, grinding reality of not enough. They had been plunged into a society of abundance, a world of more than enough, and the collision was shattering their most fundamental assumptions about how the world worked. The motifs that had so disoriented them at first were now legible as parts of a coherent story. The towering skyscrapers were not just acts of architectural hubris. They were the physical proof of a surplus of steel, of capital, and of engineering know-how. A nation that can afford to build that high, that fast, is a nation with a deep industrial base. The neon lights that had so offended Lucia's sense of wartime austerity were not just advertisements. They were a declaration of energy dominance, a signal that electricity was so plentiful it could be used for the frivolous purpose of commercial spectacle. The food, the endless, astonishing food, was the most powerful evidence of all. It demonstrated that the most basic constraint on human civilization, the ability to feed one's population, had been for all practical purposes solved by this nation. And a nation that does not have to worry about starvation can turn its full attention, its full industrial might, to the project of waging and winning a war. Sophia, the teacher, began to see the connections. The healthy bodies of the American WACs were a direct result of the food. The efficient logistics of the camp were a small-scale version of the logistics that supplied armies across 2 oceans. The confidence of the guards was the confidence of men who had never been hungry, never been cold, and never had any serious doubt that their side would win. They were fighting a war of production, and myopically, her side had thought it was a war of passion. The conflict was not between fascism and democracy as abstract ideals. It was between a system that could produce 1,000 bombers a month and one that struggled to produce 50. The outcome had been inevitable. This dawning understanding was not a relief. It did not absolve them of their choices, but it recontextualized their defeat, transforming it from a failure of spirit into a predictable consequence of material reality. The train sits in the station. It is the same train, on the same tracks, but Alina sees it differently now. The window no longer frames a confusing, alien landscape. It frames a series of facts. The steel of the rails was forged in a foundry in a place called Pittsburgh. The wood of the carriage was harvested from a forest in Oregon. The coal that will power the engine was mined from a mountain in West Virginia. She is no longer just a prisoner in a strange land. She is a passenger inside the machine, seeing its components with a new, terrible clarity. The world she came from, the world she fought for, was a world of limits. The world she is in now is a world of systems, and the two were never meant to meet on equal terms. This confrontation with a reality that shatters a deeply held worldview is not unique to these women. It is a profound human experience, one that can be both devastating and transformative. When a system reveals its true scale, how does it change the stories people tell themselves? We invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. For Alina, Sophia, and Lucia, the journey is not over. They will eventually be sent back to a country in ruins, a nation grappling with defeat, civil war, and the moral compromises of survival. They will carry with them this impossible knowledge of the world on the other side of the ocean, a knowledge that will set them apart and complicate their return in ways they cannot yet imagine. To understand what came next for these women and how they navigated the ruins of their old world with new eyes, subscribe and join us for the next part of our story. The echo of that first, overwhelming sight of a world of impossible abundance would linger for the rest of their lives.